The ballroom smelled like white roses and expensive perfume. Crystal chandeliers dripped light across the guests' faces, making every diamond glint like an accusation. I stood at the edge of the dance floor in my dress. Nothing loud, nothing flashy, exactly what I wanted. And I watched the room I had imagined loving surround my husband-to-be, Henry, with smiles that never reached their eyes. His family moved through the crowd like monarchs. They were polished. The patriarch's handshake, the mother's perfect laugh, cousins with the kind of confidence only money can buy. They clapped at speeches, toasted to our future, and quietly, like a single whisper moving through a crowd, they did what they did best. They belittled. Not with shouts. Not with scenes. They used a look, a tilt of the head, a carefully placed, "Oh, how quaint," that landed on Henry more than it ever landed on me. I noticed it first in the way they watched him reach for a plate, and then smiled at him, as if he were a quaint old servant. I heard it when his uncle said, "He's a good boy, Henry, but our world is complicated." I saw it in the way his sister's eyes flicked over his cuff, the way his mother rearranged a centerpiece when he sat down. Henry felt it too. He smiled at them, returned jokes that weren't funny, and kept his voice steady. He could have snapped a dozen times that night. He had the right, but he didn't. Instead, he kissed my forehead during the last dance as if to say, "I see it. I will remember." After the toasts and the cake, when everyone had loosened and was drifting, the small barbed comments grew bolder. "Do you think she'll be able to keep up with their circles?" someone asked. "Is Henry sure?" another murmured. They were careful, almost clinical, removing him the way a surgeon removes a tumor. I felt the pressure in my chest loosen the moment we walked out of the tent into the cool night. Henry held my hand like a promise and said, "They're loud but shallow. Don't give them weight." He kissed the back of my hand. "Let them think what they want." I laughed then, a quiet sound, because he was the only person who could make me feel safe after a night of knives hidden in silk. That winter, as the world sorted the receipts of what friends and family thought of us, Henry got quieter in ways that were not weakness. He invested in late nights in his home office, in meetings, and in quiet phone calls where his voice was clipped and precise. When I asked, he said, "Just work stuff. I'll tell you when it matters." What mattered arrived 3 months later on a gray Tuesday morning. The paper ran a short headline: Kingston Industries acquires Harrow and Vale. Deal valued at $1 billion. Below it, a smaller line noted the purchaser was a private trust and an anonymized holding company. The business pages buzzed, podcasts speculated. Social feeds lit up. Henry poured coffee and watched me watch the screen. "They'll hear," I said. He smiled that slow smile that was both calm and private. He took my hand and squeezed. "Let them. You remember the way people talk when their power is threatened, a certain hurriedness, the voice that always sounds too loud for a library." The first ripple hit Henry's mother, a phone call, short and clipped. She called my husband's sister in tears. Her husband, the patriarch, walked out of the office for the first time that week and slammed a book of family accounts on the mahogany table. They came to our house that weekend under the pretense of congratulating us. They arrived with casseroles and family concern, faces bright with practiced warmth. The center of the visit was not their congratulations, but a parade of questions like landmines. "How is this all structured? Are you sure your son understands the taxes? Which of our family members will be on the board?" They peppered Henry with advice wrapped as offers. They offered connections, introductions, cautious alliances. And Henry listened, with eyes that looked like a man mapping a chessboard. When they left that evening, they thought they had covered their bases. Their shoulders were lighter, as if they had secured a future. They didn't notice the way Henry's lips tightened when their car lights disappeared down the lane. Then the notices came. One by one, subtle and official. Board appointments rescinded, previously promised job offers pulled, credit facilities frozen pending review. A supplier that had always prioritized the King family's businesses announced they were terminating preferred terms. A bank that had for generations given the family favorable rates updated their terms to stricter covenants. The first time Henry's father, A man who had once walked into any room like he owned it, called me directly and begged. I felt the blood leave my face. "You must tell your husband to be reasonable," he pleaded. "This will ruin us." Reasonable. God, I knew the word well. I watched Henry for days after that call. He didn't rage. He didn't gloat. He moved with that same slow, deliberate patience he'd used on the night of our wedding. What he did instead was gather evidence. He had receipts, contracts, recordings, decades of interactions between the family's companies and the network of favors they traded. He compiled everything into neat folders and sent them to 3 places: the legal team, a rival business ally, and a small, strategic network of journalists who had always honored truth over gossip. Then, late on a Wednesday, Henry sent one quiet email. It went to the board of directors of Kingston Industries and the legal countersignatories of the old family's flagship company. Its subject line read, "Compliance Review, Potential Conflicts and Misrepresentations." Attached were documents and timestamps showing that the King Group had intentionally misrepresented financials and diverted trust assets in ways that endangered minority stakeholders and violated fiduciary duty. I watched as the dominoes began to fall. Regulatory review notices, immediate audits, inquiries from investors who had once smiled at cocktail parties now asked for formal briefings. Stock took a painful dip. Contracts contingent on solid governance were suspended pending investigation. At first, they called their lawyers. They screamed. They denounced Henry in statements that read like the last tremors of a dying empire. "An act of spite," the matriarch said in an interview, voice trembling with indignation. "He is trying to ruin a good family." The guests at the wedding, who once whispered quaint about Henry, now whispered in a different tone fear. They were afraid, mostly of what Henry might do next. But Henry, in his way, was kinder than the fear allowed. He never sought to humiliate them in public. There were no shouting exposés, no viral accusations. He let the law, the markets, and truth do the work. He made sure that every step he took was accompanied by a light that exposed wrongdoing for what it was. He placed no trap, he opened a window. Weeks turned into months. Their invitations stopped coming. Shares were docked pending audit outcomes. Friends who once called them for favors now called lawyers to distance themselves. The patriarch, who once brokered deals with a crook's smile, stopped answering calls. The matriarch, who had spent a life manufacturing perfection, now watched her name splinter on social feeds and in legal documents. At night, she called Henry. Not to apologize, she asked for mercy. Not for her actions, but for their consequences. Henry listened, and in his silence I heard something like a final accounting. He told her what she needed to hear. "We acted out of the truth we knew. Now you must answer for the choices you made." She cried for the first time I'd ever heard her. But tears were not a reset button. Papers and regulators don't respect performative grief. Months later, the family still lived under a small, practical terror. They watched the calendar for court dates and listened to their phones for the next inquiry. They feared not only public ruin, but the private unspooling of reputations they had built on artifice. They feared Henry's next quiet move. Another legal letter, another audit, perhaps a board appointment that would finally give them a voice in the oversight they'd once avoided. And Henry? He didn't gloat. He planted a small garden behind our house one spring, and when I asked why, he said simply, "I like the honest work." He kissed my forehead and added, "They needed to know what it feels like to be seen clearly. I wanted them to learn that respect isn't borrowed." I never asked him whether he would have exposed them if they'd behaved differently. I never needed to. We lived in a house that was honest, quiet most nights, and finally ours. Moral of the story: power built on contempt is always brittle. Kindness mistaken for weakness is not a weakness at all. It's a promise that can be kept with patience, evidence, and love. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe for more true-to-life stories about betrayal, quiet justice, and the strength it takes to protect the people you love.